I try to explain what I'm capable of, but we don't have the million years it would take for you to understand. Some, I guess, cultural pop references were, of course, The Wizard of Oz, Sunset Boulevard, Citizen Kane, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, the archetype of the wizard and what happens to him when he gets bored, you know, and he becomes a trickster. Guys, if I was gonna do an exploding chair, why wouldn't I just do an exploding floor? And I think when we meet He Who Remains, he's on the borderline of those two things. You don't really know where he's at. And I think the ambiguity of that is one of the wicked things about it. You think I'm just here with you. Whoo! I am everywhere.
Like, we're watching the flowering of the next phase of the Marvel Universe.
The variant of He Who Remains, the one he's been talking about, the one that he's so afraid of,
See you soon.
is Kang. Kang is bent on destruction, and I'm so curious to see what Jonathan does in the future.
I think with He Who Remains, the objective for me was to give me the largest canvas possible. And then from that, as Kang begins to rear his head and do his deeds, in so many ways, he has no choice but to be in opposition or to be different from He Who Remains.
Welcome back, everyone. This is going to be my brand new Loki Kang video. There were a whole bunch of deleted scenes that they just released, so we'll break it all down. Obviously, Jonathan Majors talking a lot about the different versions of him and distinguishing between the He Who Remains version that we saw and the Kang the Conqueror version that we're going to see during Ant-Man 3 Quantumania. And it seems like during Loki Season 2. So if you're brand new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to get all the videos, and careful for spoilers from the Loki series if you haven't seen those episodes yet, because this is obviously Jonathan Majors and Tom Hiddleston, the other production crew, the Marvel executives, talking a lot about Kang the Conqueror and what's going on with his future in the MCU. So biggest thing here, obviously, I think is that they clarify which version of Kang Loki is looking at that statue at the TVA, or the version of the TVA that he goes back to, saying that that is supposed to be the true version of Kang the Conqueror, the version that he's probably going to be playing during Ant-Man 3 Quantumania. And I love how Jonathan Majors talks about how that Kang is going to be like the antithesis of He Who Remains Kang, making him sound super hardcore. Like he says that that version can't help but be the opposite of He Who Remains, given the way that they all exist in the multiverse. Like they're all in opposition. So all the different versions of Kang are supposed to feel very different, and they will when they show up. Like they'll do all the different comic book versions of Kang, like Scarlet Centurion, Rama Tut eventually, but all in different ways. But eventually you do have to have like a main alternate version of Kang who was supposed to be the worst, like the darkest timeline version of Kang. And the way they talk about him, the way that Jonathan Majors talks about Kang the Conqueror, this statue in the TVA, it sounds like that's who this is going to be. So it's not just that another version of Kang seems like he's winning the multiversal war that looks like Kang from the comics, is that the worst version of Kang seems like he won the multiversal war, or is in the process of winning it. At least the way Mobius and Hunter B-15 are shouting about the 63 branching timelines going past Redline at the end of the episode just makes it sound like the multiverse war still might be in the process of happening when Loki comes back. Like, all is not completely lost, but it definitely seems like all might be lost. And that's the big cliffhanger, like how do we fix this during Season 2 and in the other Marvel movies where they deal with the Kang character, or Kang variants? The way he spoke about the history of the multiverse war during the actual episode, he says the key to him winning the first war was Alioth. So in the new multiverse war, as it's playing out, or as it seems like it's in the middle of playing out, when this true Kang the Conqueror version is resurrected, so to speak, like the way He Who Remains talks about resurrection, maybe he winds up doing something differently when their timelines all reset that gives him an advantage over He Who Remains in the second time around. But then in some of the deleted scenes, he talks about how he's not just in the room with them here, he's everywhere. That's both a reference to his variants, he's metaphorically and literally everywhere in the multiverse, but it's also a reference to the way he spent millions of years traveling through time and manipulating time to create and maintain the sacred timeline, his own personal timeline. So if you could see in the fourth dimension, you'd see him up and down the timeline all over the place at different points in history. That's also a big Easter egg for Kang in the comics, working with other versions of himself across the timeline, past, present, and future, banding together to control all of time in a sort of pyramid scheme. But it's not a multiverse story, it's just a single timeline, and it's just versions of him from his future and his past working together. Obviously, that's a little bit different in the MCU. They're going with more of a multiverse variance approach, where you do have versions of Kang banding together, forming councils of Kangs. but it's from different timelines. It's not from the same timeline. Like, each own Kang is the Conqueror of his own timeline in a way. I do like that Jonathan Majors mentions Willy Wonka in the Chocolate Factory as one of the inspirations for this version of Kang, He Who Remains, the older Immortus version of the character. I mentioned that a couple times during my Loki finale video, just because he's a character here at the end of his story who's grown tired of his life's mission, this grand plan that he's had, and wants to pass on his responsibilities to a worthy successor so that he can either die or retire, or in the case of the Loki series with this He Who Remains character, kind of both. If it wasn't clear why it seemed like he didn't care either way what happened to him, it was just because he'd grown tired of what he'd been doing for millions and millions of years. There's a whole bunch of Easter eggs all over the Citadel at the end of time too, inside with the artifacts that he has, the design language. They go into that in pretty great detail as well. Even the costume that he wears is meant to be like a big walking Easter egg. Like, he mentions that he gets all of his clothing pieces from different points in history.
He Who Remains has lived forever, you know, and one of the great things I got to experience with our costume designer is that every piece we decided was from a different place. The cape I had on was from the Victoria era. The shoes are from Genghis Khan. The pants from Mongolia, etc. You know, you just mix and match it together, and it informs the character.
I think that it will be talked about for a long time.
We're dancing. Very nice. We're dancing.
There's also the deleted scene of him talking about it taking millions of years to explain himself fully to Loki and Sylvie. He's not lying. He does give them the epic Cliff's Notes version, speed running his personal history and the true history of the multiverse. They also talk a lot about the Wizard of Oz during this, how they use that as a guiding metaphor for forming the concept of the character, someone who was the driving force of the story, looming large over all the characters, and then they repeat the line, finding the man behind the curtain, in the idea that you're supposed to have this really big surprise when Loki and Sylvie find the character, like someone that you completely were not expecting. The way they actually talk about the design of the Citadel, though, they said it's supposed to feel like a combination of Hearst Castle, Xanadu, this palatial estate, to make a real-world comparison, this huge monstrosity of a personal project that He Who Remains created over thousands and thousands of years that eventually just abandoned in his boredom. Like, the castle is supposed to isolate him, protect him from his variants that could potentially rise up should one have broken free from a branch timeline over the millions of years that he's been here. So in addition to Miss Minutes and Eliath, there are meant to be a lot of defensive measures that he built into the Citadel itself that you don't really see here because it's fallen into so much disrepair. But it's a Citadel because it was meant to defend him during the Multiverse War when it was still happening before. But the interesting thing, though, is that a lot of the rubble that you see around the Citadel inside when they're walking around, when they first walk through the entryway, it isn't from battle damage. It's just because over the millions of years, He Who Remains Kang has allowed it to fall into disrepair. Like, he literally just does not care about anything anymore. He's just completely retreated up to the upper levels in his office. So when they're talking about some of the other inspirations for what was going on here at the end of time with the Citadel, they also said that they use Grey Gardens. Like, this once great estate has since turned into this decrepit version of itself because its owner has turned into a bit of a hermit retreating to the upper levels over millions of years. And he just refuses to fix all the stuff that's breaking down at the lower levels. The other interesting detail here, too, is that the production designer would not clarify if the fourth Timekeeper statue was broken because it had fallen into disrepair like the rest of the castle, or if He Who Remains Kang had destroyed it himself, or if it was damage from one of the other previous Lokis that they hint at that had made his way to the castle to be tested if he was worthy to take over. But the whole thing with that fourth Timekeeper statue is the production designer said that they weren't allowed to speak about it in general just because Marvel would be covering that in an upcoming story. But they didn't say if that'd be Loki Season 2, Ant-Man 3, or some other project. But I'm assuming they're going to save it for Loki Season 2. I talked a little about it in my Loki finale video. In the comics, there was a fourth Timekeeper called the Oracle of Siwa who was banished by He Who Remains from the comics to ancient Egypt, and he helped the Fantastic Four fight another different time travel villain that wasn't Kang. You can clearly read the inscription on the floor. It reads, Omnia Tempus Enim Semper. In Latin, that reads, for all time, always. You probably could have guessed that without being able to read Latin. You also see a much more detailed pattern of the phases of the moon that's etched into the floor, and in the concept art you can see what this room was meant to be. It's basically the inside of a giant clock. Like, there's a giant clock structure that was meant to be up above this, but it basically means the entire Citadel itself is meant to feel like a giant clock, like they're walking into a giant clock, which makes sense that time is such a huge metaphor for He Who Remains, so that he just baked that into the idea of the construction of the Citadel itself. The Citadel itself became a giant celestial clock, so to speak. If you remember the giant statues seen in the entryway chamber that have the clocks for faces, they refer to those as the Sentinels of Time. They didn't say whether or not they're meant to be actual creations of He Who Remains, or if they're just artistic expression like metaphors. You don't really get a solid close-up of everything on his shelves, but you do see what look like a lot of ancient Egyptian artifacts behind them when Loki and Sylvie are fighting, which is yet another Rama Tut Easter egg for the very first version of Kang to debut in the comics, like the Great Sphinx or the Great Pyramid. A lot of you have also asked if we're going to see Rama Tut show up during the Eternals movie or if there'll be an Easter egg for him, because that's going to cover the ancient history of the Earth in the MCU. It's possible that they do have some minor Easter egg, but I don't think that Jonathan Majors was supposed to have a cameo during the Eternals movie. So if we see a really big Rama Tut Kang Easter egg, it might be during the Moon Knight series next year, because that trades so heavily on Egyptian history. So if you spotted any other big Easter eggs that I didn't talk about during the video or my last couple of Kang videos, just write them below in the comments. Or if you have any big questions about what's going on with the upcoming Marvel Phase 4 movies or the other Disney Plus series, the Marvel What If episodes are going to start in a couple weeks. I will be doing full episode videos for that. And that's meant to build on a lot of this multiverse craziness that they set up at the end of Loki. There's also supposed to be a couple trailers coming in the next couple of weeks too, so whenever those get released, of course I'll do videos for them. Everyone click here for more Loki deleted scenes and to learn about the alternate ending from the finale, and click here for all my Loki episode videos. Thank you so much for watching, everyone stay safe, and I'll see you guys tonight.